attendees, right?
Yeah, we'll go ahead and hit start webinar.
Okay.
We'll start letting people in. Let's see if they're.
Give people a few minutes to move from one thing to the other.
It looks like we've had a few people. We've had some attendees. It looks like the attendees have started to arrive. So I think we can go ahead and get started.
Okay. All right.
Attendees, right?
What? Are we okay? All right. Thank you for joining us on our last week of classes here, and also on a very rainy Tuesday. But fortunately, you're on Zoom, so you don't have to move very much from your point of departure. One of the things I was thinking about as we were talking and before the session was also to think about Brazil a little bit as a doppelganger, and we can be sort of thinking a little bit about its role, its response to the dictatorship, and its resistance to renewal of dictatorships. And part of that resistance comes from the recovery of memory and the creation of systems that resist authoritarian regimes. I don't want to, make a too broad a comparison here, but it's really important to look at the dynamics of places that have overcome authoritarianism, and also the roles of history and the roles of memory in shaping the resistance and the thinking about social history. We're really delighted to have Jake Blanc with us from, as I say, Free Speech Canada. Those of us who deal with climate change find that we are often muzzled. But he is an associate professor of history and international development studies at McGill. I first met him actually in the Graduate Institute in Switzerland, from the Graduate Institute for International Development, where he had an office next to me, and we often chatted. And this led to probably what he has come to remember as an unpleasant relationship, but since he was always nagging me to get my paper in. But he edited an extremely important recent volume called Writing from the Interior. I think it just came out in the spring, in a few months ago at University of Texas. What's very interesting about this is that it really does take history from the inside, and what you'll see in our presentation today is also taking history from the inside of dynamics rather than merely its coastal or its more formal dynamics. I have also known his work through his studies on dams. These pharaonic devices have become kind of political hot spots in resistance movements, but the one he wrote about, Itaipu, was a little bit prior to the larger scale resistance to massive big project infrastructure. So he's always been a bit ahead of the curve. The other thing that I have also been very interested in his work is his study of the Prestes Column, which was a resistance movement that moved really from south of Brazil all the way through the north, and its political importance in shaping the Brazilian national culture. So I think it's really important to listen to yet another sort of brilliant intervention by Jake on the questions of Brazilian history. So having said that, let me turn it over to Jake.
Okay, thank you so much, Susanna, and to Brian for organizing this talk, and to everyone joining us on Zoom. It really is a pleasure to get the chance to talk to the Latin American Studies Institute and the Brazilian Studies Institute at UCLA. I'm originally from California. I'm from San Francisco. I did my undergrad at UC San Diego. So, just a lot of pride in the UC system and the, public education in my home state. And I'm happy to be back here. I guess one small funny thing I hadn't even thought to say, I did not get into UCLA for undergrad. That is why I ended up being a UC San Diego Triton instead of a Bruin. And I'm still proud of that. So anyway.
Perpetual shame, it has to be said.
I really came into my own academically as a better student in college. High school was okay. So fair enough, UCLA, for that admission decision. Okay, so and thank you, Susanna, for the really kind words and introduction. And as Susanna kind of alluded to, my research trajectory has taken me along a lot of different paths in Brazilian history. My first book was on the Itaipu Dam and rural resistance to Brazil's dictatorship. I then wrote a book on the Prestes Column Rebellion and its legacies across 20th century Brazil. And it was through that project on thinking about the interior of Brazil that I collaborated a lot with Susanna. She wrote the epilogue for this volume that we edited. And the book that I'm going to be presenting on today, and I'll share some slides in a moment, is my third book that in some ways was unexpected, and I'll get to that in a moment, how it came about. But in a lot of ways also it fed from the first two projects in trying to think about history from the margins. And we're going to get to some of those ideas, particularly as it relates to memory and one's sense of history. Because the project that I worked on that I'm going to be talking about today, it's coming out next month, is a biography of a human rights activist in Brazil named Aluízio Palmar, who had been a political prisoner and a torture victim during the dictatorship. And I'll talk later about how I got to know Aluízio over the years. And by memory and history from the margins, we're going to explore what it means for kind of important but not famous individuals to narrate their own lives, and how that process of kind of transforming one's intimate, kind of deeply personal, often traumatic memories into larger narrative fits not only into questions of historical context and transitions from military to civilian rule and its aftermaths, but more importantly, at kind of a granular individual level, how people understand their own place in history and how that relates to storytelling. I've always taught a lot of classes on memory and memory studies, particularly in Latin America, which for very unfortunate reasons has been a very kind of rich region for studying trauma and post-dictatorship violence and memory. And this is what kind of serendipitously led me to this project with Aluízio Palmar, which I will get to talking about now. Okay, so I will share some slides. And okay, does that look good? Susanna, Brian, can I get a thumbs up?
Looks fabulous.
Okay. All right. So the title for my talk today is, cribbed directly from the book that will be coming out next month. Actually, this is the first time that I get to present this research while saying that it's coming out next month. Searching for Memory, Aluízio Palmar and the Shadow of Dictatorship in Brazil. And just to give everyone a little bit of a sense of what I'll be talking about today, I'm going to overview kind of who is Aluízio Palmar. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own methodology in terms of how to study memory and also using memory as a source of methodology. I'll give a very kind of quick overview of this framework that I developed for the book that I call a memory script, kind of a way to make sense of how people share their memories in a way that is patterned and performative. So really thinking about kind of the specifics of how memory becomes history. And then I'll talk through three examples from Aluízio's life and from my interactions with Aluízio during our interviews to give a sense of the different mediums through which people like Aluízio Palmar, human rights activists, memory activists, share their stories. One will be a published writing, one will be a Facebook post, and then the Truth Commission testimonial of a perpetrator. Because when we're thinking about the legacies and memories of dictatorial violence, it's not only about the victims and the activists, right? We also have to pay attention to the memories of perpetrators, right? And we're going to talk about why that's particularly insightful in Brazil, a place that has not had criminal investigations and Truth Commission trials for punitive procedures against human rights abusers. Okay, so I want to start this talk with where my project very much kind of originated. And that is that in December of 2019, Aluízio Palmar was sued by his own torturer, man pictured here named Mario Expedito Ostrovsky, right? This is like a jarring, quite a crazy statement to say. Aluízio, nearly 80 years old at this point, was sued by the military officer who had physically and perversely tortured him 40 years earlier while Aluízio was a political prisoner under Brazil's dictatorship. So how is it that somebody can be sued by their own torturer, right? We're going to circle back to this later, but shows us that history is not linear. And even 30 years after Brazil's kind of transition to civilian rule, politics can switch. And under the presidency of kind of right-wing firebrand and military apologist Jair Bolsonaro, people like this torturer, Ostrovsky, can kind of reemerge feeling emboldened to victimize their victims again. So we're going to come back to this, but I want this to set the scene for thinking about the importance of memory and the ongoing memory battles that continue to shape our understandings of what happened in Brazil. So here's a picture of Aluízio Palmar from just a few years after he was tortured by Ostrovsky. Here, he is actually living clandestinely in Argentina, working for a militant revolutionary organization, living undercover as a tea plantation worker in order to kind of run intel and surveillance along the Brazil-Argentina border. And earlier, I'd mentioned the kind of importance of studying history from the margins. And here, what I mean by the margins is the sense that Aluízio Palmar is not famous, right? Very few Brazilians, if you were to stop him on the street, would know who he is. He kind of, in some ways, Forrest Gumped his way through life, that he was there at key moments and involved with key procedures and political organizations and campaigns throughout much of his life. But if you ask the average Brazilian, they don't know who Aluízio is. He ended up being somewhat of a big fish in the small pond in the border city of Foz do Iguaçu, where he ended up living out his life, but he himself is not a well-known figure. And that makes it a really interesting person to use as a biography to study narrative and memory for Brazilian history, because to the extent that Aluízio has become a more famous or a more known figure, particularly in human rights circles, it's connected to the fact that he, over the last 20 years, has told his life story over and over again, right? He has elevated his own memories into larger public narratives. As we're going to see, this is an intricate part of the human rights activism that he does. And as he started to do more investigations into the disappearances from the dictatorship, the more he started to narrate his own life as a form of legitimacy to share those memories and to even do the investigations themselves. And we'll come back to this in a little bit. So first, to give an overview of Aluízio's life, which, as we'll see, will help us understand the kind of path into dictatorship and out as well for Brazil as a whole. In the 1960s, Aluízio, like a lot of young people, teenagers, those in their early 20s and 30s, students, he had initially become radicalized by joining the Brazilian Communist Party. Actually, I should pause also and say there's some construction going on next door, so you might hear some, construction noises in the background. So Aluízio joins the Brazilian Communist Party in the 1960s, and then after the coup that established the dictatorship in 1964, Aluízio will join a not insignificant, but not a huge number of those who had been in radical circles who break with the Communist Party, thinking that the Communist Party was not radical enough, and who then join armed revolutionary groups. Aluízio joins one that was called the MR8, the Movimento Revolucionário 8 de Outubro, that, along with a few other dozen organizations at different moments in the late 1960s and early 1970s, opt for guerrilla-style armed resistance to the dictatorship. Aluízio will eventually be captured in 1969, and he is imprisoned and violently tortured for 2 years in prison. He gets shuttled between different detention centers in the state of Paraná and Rio de Janeiro, and eventually he wins his freedom. He's given his freedom as part of a prisoner exchange when another one of the armed groups in Brazil kidnapped the Swiss ambassador, and in an exchange for the life of the Swiss ambassador, 70 militants are freed and given exile in Chile, and Aluízio is one of those. And he will then go on to spend most of the 1970s in Chile and then in Argentina, increasingly kind of off the radar. He initially stays part of an armed revolutionary group. There are several snafus that almost lead him to be captured and killed again, and he eventually just goes off the radar entirely and lives under a false name with false documents with his family in northern Argentina. And will eventually, after the amnesty law in 1979, come back to Brazil and get involved in the campaign to bring back civilian rule. He starts a newspaper in the border city of Foz do Iguaçu called Nosso Tempo, which you see here, and he becomes quite involved with several local political campaigns, all towards the goal of bringing democracy back in Brazil. In the 1990s, Aluízio's life takes several transitions in the way that Brazil more broadly does too. This is a time in the aftermath of Brazil writing a new constitution in 1988, where the question of how to grapple with what had happened in Brazil remains paramount. Still on the books is the 1979 amnesty law, meaning that no perpetrators of human rights abuses, those who had been working within the military regime, could be held accountable, right? This was part of the amnesty law that allowed exiles to return, the reinstatement of political rights for those who had lost their jobs, several other kind of political freedoms returned, and in part in this compromise towards the end of military dictatorship, human rights abuses could not be investigated. Things start to change a little bit in the 1990s, where you get certain figures starting to come forward and either offer testimony about what had happened. Here on the left, you see the image of Veja, the magazine in 1992, where really for the first time, an official in the armed forces will admit to the wide-scale human rights abuses that had happened. And in the Folha do Paraná there should actually say 2000, not 2010. And this leads to a whole series of kind of other investigations and government efforts at accountability. Eventually, this will touch on Aluízio's life as well. And he, at this point, is living in Foz do Iguaçu. And here's this image from a newspaper in 2000, not 2010, I need to change that, that nudged Aluízio onto what we can kind of consider his third career in life. First one was an armed militant. Second one, he was a journalist in the 1980s. And then really starting in the late 1990s and 2000s, he becomes a human rights activist. A reporter had gone to the borderlands and asked him about kind of existence of Operation Condor in the borderlands more generally. And it was from this, he had already been quite interested and always kind of haunted by the case of 6 disappearances in particular of his comrades, those who were in a group that he was in the 1970s, who had been reputed to have been lured back to Brazil under false pretenses by a double agent within the military regime and killed, most likely in the Iguaçu National Park. So it was through this kind of trickle of new information coming out, really instigated by perpetrators, so those who were within the military regime who started to admit some amount of information of what was happening, that triggers then this other large-scale form of searches, of investigations. And Aluízio will then kind of take on a one-man journey to find the bodies of these 6 disappeared colleagues of his. And it is as he starts doing this investigation that he starts talking about his own life more. I did a lot of interviews with him, I'll talk about in a second, also with his kids. And to a point, everyone says that Aluízio never talked about what happened to him in his past until he started searching for the disappeared. Right. And so here we see other newspaper articles about him here saying the excavation, looking for the bodies, is the result of persistence, right? And the persistence being Aluízio's kind of doggedness. And he starts to talk about his own past as a way to have the legitimacy and more of a public spotlight on the searches that he's doing in the early 2000s. And will end up being 3 excavations at different sites between about a 10-year period. none of which ever lead to any results. To this day, there is zero tangible evidence of where those 6 disappeared militants are, right, where they were buried. So this is an ongoing open wound, essentially, in the social body for Aluízio and family members of the disappeared. And it is through doing these investigations that Aluízio then becomes kind of a full-time memory activist. He establishes a Center for Human Rights and Popular Memory in Foz do Iguaçu. He starts writing a lot. He writes his own memoir, first published in 2005, and goes through several reprintings. We see here. He starts a website called Revealed Documents, which he claims is the largest private website of declassified military documents in Latin America. And he has something like 3,500 different essays that he posts, along with 70,000 different PDFs, all kind of cataloged and labeled on his website, right? So he's really doing this work over and over again of trying to, as he says on his website, to reveal the history and the memories of what had happened. And he also becomes this kind of quite prolific public speaker, of going and meeting with journalists and students, both at high school and university level. He becomes involved with the Truth Commission in Brazil, which we'll talk about in a second. And so we see him narrating his life. Really, at this point, he is in his 60s and then his 70s and is now in his 80s. So this late in life transition from a political militant to a human rights activist. And as I explore in the book, it's his process of starting to narrate his own life and share his own memories that's really the crux of what he's doing there. And part of the reason that people like Aluízio have to do this is because the more official legal routes of transitional justice in Brazil came late, if they came at all. Brazil did not have its Truth Commission until 2012. It issued its final report in 2014, making it the last country in Latin America to do so. The last country in Latin America to officially grapple with and investigate the past human rights abuses from a period of military rule. Right? Compared to places like Argentina and Uruguay and Chile that conducted theirs almost immediately after the return to civilian rule. Brazil, because of the 1979 amnesty law, and despite several legal challenges that then upheld the validity of this law, this amnesty law, Brazil was left really with a more ruptured sense of a shared understanding of its history. And it's not to say that in places like Argentina and Chile, it is a linear sense of memory where everyone just agrees on the narrative of what happened and everything is kumbaya, right? As we see, especially in places like Argentina recently, this continues to be a contested memory. But Brazil, I'm always wary as a historian of ever using the E word to say exceptional, but Brazil's case is quite, we'll say, concentrated, where this lack of Truth Commission and this lack of an investigation into Brazil's past then allows for somebody like the eventual president Jair Bolsonaro to come in and make claims about history, really kind of rewriting the historical narratives that give them legitimacy. Right. And it is through that avenue that somebody like Aluízio, Palmar's torturer, can sue Aluízio, right? Years and years and years after the fact. Because there were no trials against perpetrators of human rights abuses, it is then falling to people like Aluízio, human rights activists, to change the narrative about past violence, right? So narrating their own life. And this brings us to kind of this question of memory in the context of impunity, and impunity being the 1979 amnesty law, which precludes trials against perpetrators. So self-narrating one's life story, going out of your way, actively promoting your own life story as a form of legitimacy, right? Using your memories as a way to say, I was there, I fought against the dictatorship, I survived the brutality of torture in prison. Right? It's mixing the personal and the political, which aims to correct historical narratives and also have really tangible political goals in the present, right? Which for Aluízio was primarily the investigations to find the bodies of the 6 disappeared militants, but also to push more broadly, like with several other groups and these waves of political activism across Brazil, to finally get a truth commission. Right? Most of Aluízio's efforts to find the bodies were in the first decade of the 21st century. Brazil's Truth Commission did not get underway until 2012. So it was pushing memory and one's own self of history to try to enact different political goals. Okay, so a little bit, how do I fit into this? And this is kind of an awkward embrace of using kind of the first person that I eventually couldn't avoid in the book, because so much of the book actually is about my own interactions with Aluízio. I had known Aluízio since doing research for my first book, which was my PhD dissertation, which was on the Itaipu Dam, which is just outside of Foz do Iguaçu. And as I had said, Aluízio is kind of a big fish in the smallish pond of Foz do Iguaçu. So when I was there in 2013, 2014, I spent a decent amount of time with Aluízio. He put me in touch with people to interview, helped me get in contact with people who ran local archives, labor unions, things like that. We'd stayed in touch over the years. He would send me some of the work that he was doing. I let him know the progress of my book. And I kind of always had a sense of what his life had entailed, but it wasn't until I saw him posting widely on Facebook and a lot of my other Facebook contacts in Brazil doing the same thing about the lawsuit against him that I realized kind of just how broad his life history touched upon what was now going on under Bolsonaro's Brazil. So I got in touch with Aluízio and I said, hey, this is crazy. You're getting sued by your former torturer. What can I do to help? And he says, oh, let's tell my story in the English-speaking world. So I interviewed him and I wrote a piece for Nakala, kind of helping bring more attention to what was going on against him. This was part of a very large international campaign. People were covering it across Latin America and Europe. I did my very, very small part on writing about it for a North American Anglophone audience. Eventually, I can kind of preview it. The lawsuit does get thrown out about 6 months later. So that part of Aluízio being victimized kind of goes away. But the difference between December 2019, when we first did this interview, and a few months later was COVID hit. So flash forward 4 or 5 months, it's May of 2020. We're all, cowering inside, trying to figure out how and why the world is going to crap. And I find myself feeling very, unmotivated by my other research project. No offense to the book that I wrote on the press desk column. And with extra time on my hands now that the semester has ended, and I'm just kind of terrified for the world in general, but I'm also terrified for Aluízio, this person that I had been in touch with a lot over the preceding months. Aluízio at this point is almost 80. He is a diabetic and he's living under Bolsonaro's Brazil during a global pandemic, right? Like the odds were that he was going to die. So I kind of had this thought of, okay, someone needs to write a book, Aluízio. He has this amazing life story. I just kind of reconnected with him and we did this long interview. And I pitch him on the idea of writing a biography. And he says, great, let's do it. And we then go on to record interview at first weekly for several months, and then spaced out over, it'll end up being about 2 years of interviews. And the book transformed like entirely over the course of writing it. Initially, I didn't really have a sense of what it was going to be. I just knew I wanted to do a lot of interviews with Aluízio and do something like a biography. I'd not done a biography before. I have a background in journalism, so I'm comfortable with that type of methodological approach, but at this scale, I'd never done it. And at first, it was mostly just interviews with Aluízio, and then I would broaden it out, do kind of a lot of engagement with his other public memory work. The internet is amazing for all the work that he had been doing for the last several decades. Everything is on YouTube. He had maintained a blog, like a WordPress blog that like thankfully was somehow still in existence and operable. And then Facebook. He uses a lot of Facebook. And I also did 36 interviews with other people in his life, family members, other militants, other human rights activists. And I was then also eventually able to do a fair amount of archival work, both digitized archives and actual archives in Brazil too. And what ended up happening through this was it became something that I kind of call a collaborative biography. And a collaborative biography in the sense that early on, I said, hey, Aluízio, do you want to co-author this with me, right? Like for scholars of Latin America, writing anything close to biography, the question, this like blaring siren at the front of our minds is, David stole Rigoberta Menchú controversy, right? So I wanted to make sure that there was nothing anywhere close to that type of kind of perhaps a manipulative or extractive relationship in the biography. And so I offered Aluízio co-authorship, or even have, him to be first author, whatever he wanted. And he said, no, you do it. I have too much work going on. Right. Also, in the sense, and this will fit in later, is he wanted to have a professional biography written about him. Right. He was happy to cede authorship at that level because it would help boost his profile. The process that we ended up doing instead was, because I really did want to make it as collaborative as possible, is he read every chapter draft of the entire book. So we did all of our interviews, and once I started writing everything up, I would finish a chapter, I would translate it into Portuguese, and I would send it to him. And he would read it and he would give comments. And a lot of times the comments were, small corrections or, historical accuracy or an acronym or somebody's last name. But other corrections or comments that he gave were substantive, and they really then showed me how much he was attuned to his own memory script. And I'll describe that later, in the sense of knowing a custom story that he has told for decades about his own life. Sometimes he would tell me that I needed to add something else. Other times he would tell me to take something out. And what I eventually had to figure out was how to make those changes in a way that was transparent to my reader. So whenever there were the instance of him wanting me to put something in or take something out that felt insightful on the larger arguments that I'm making in the book, I wrote about it. Right, it's kind of breaking down this third wall of historical scholarship, where I'm not only engaging directly with the subject of my biography, but I'm telling my reader how the interactions shifted the book, right? And so it's as much of a living document as possible. And I'll give a few examples today. And just to give kind of a very small hint at the framework that I developed in the book for trying to make sense of this kind of very complex web of emotional, kind of personal, political minutia of memory, is this framework called a memory script, which I present and I hope is a way to help scholars of Latin America, globally as well, for thinking through the process of self-narration. So not just understanding kind of memory as the product of the moment in which it is articulated, but also thinking about how over time the process of sharing memories has quite tangible impacts. And so, I'll give a bit of an example today, but the three characteristics of this memory script is that it's practiced, right? So someone like Aluízio is doing that memory work a lot. It's on his website and the human rights organization that he runs, and his writing and his interviews, right? He practices his craft. It's also repetitive. Right? Like all storytelling, it requires a structure. It requires the repetition of certain details, right? That's where it gets the power to really correct a historical narrative, right? For someone like Aluízio Palmar, who is fighting against this culture of impunity, you have to keep repeating the same details to prove that it is legitimate and that it has validity in changing a narrative. And then finally, a memory script is performative, right? Like all scripts, it has to have an audience. And so he is always aware of who his story is being shared for and why that matters, right? So there's a performative aspect of it. And that is also at the heart of why he wanted me to write the biography about him, right? Rather than him be involved in it too, right? He wants as large of an audience as possible. And having a North American scholar do that and perform kind of this professional biography is part of it. So this also means that I had to be self-reflexive, right? And I kind of mentioned this earlier, and then I'll get to the memories in just a second, in the sense of I needed to write myself into the biography. And this was extremely hard for me to do at first. I really kind of struggled with how to do this well. But by being self-reflexive, it allowed me to be honest with the reader of where I saw patterns and omissions and discrepancies in Aluízio's memory script. Right? Otherwise, it would have been difficult for me to just criticize the memories that he's saying without placing them in a larger context of how and why he shares his memories. And this is particularly important because so many of his memories are shaped by the fact that they are traumatic memories, right? He was tortured. He was a victim of military violence. And so to be able to understand how and why he articulates certain memories is to both place him within the context of having been traumatized, but also not defining him and his stories by trauma, right? I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a mental health professional. I'm not credentialed to give him an official diagnosis of trauma, right? It's quite clear that these are traumatic memories for him. And so having this self-reflexive methodology is a way that I found was useful for dealing with these webs of feelings and kind of quite strong memories. Okay, so I want to leave some time for questions, so I'll just kind of like zoom through some of these quite quickly. Let me see. Brian, can you just tell me how much time do I have left just to know whether I need to skip one of these?
Oh, I think you can. I mean, we don't have a set time. Most of our talks, 45, 50 minutes probably.
Okay. Great. Okay, that's what I was hoping for. Just wanted to make sure I'm still on track for that. Okay, so here, let's just talk through kind of 3 examples of the memories and the memory scripts that are featured in the book. Let's start with the first one, which has also, I think, the best title, My Sweet Trotskyist. So this is a memory that comes from one of Aluízio's published writings. He contributed a chapter in a book published as part of the lead up to the Truth Commission by the Ministry of Justice and the Amnesty Commission called 68, The Generation That Wanted to Move the World, right? Memories or anecdotes. And what he writes about here is kind of this little story in his life from when he was a young militant before he went and joined the armed underground. And it's an example of when Aluízio wanted me to add something into the book. He had told me this story originally. He had also posted about it on Facebook. And when he told me about it initially, so much of my job as writing, then editing and revising the book is, okay, I have 40 hours of interviews. I can't include everything. And so initially I thought this was one that was interesting, but wasn't quite worth making it into the book. But this is an instance where he kind of insisted. He's like, hey, you didn't put in that story about the sweet Trotskyist. That matters to me. And so I then was able to reflect more and see that there's several moments in the book where Aluízio uses a woman character to kind of mark a turning point in his life. So let's see what the story of the sweet Trotskyist is in a second, and then I'll reflect on that a little bit more. So, okay, I'll say. So Aluízio is telling this story about when he was handing out leaflets at the docks in Niterói, the industrial port city just across from the bay from Rio de Janeiro. And he is with a group called Port, which was a Trotskyist political organization, was flyering, right, to try to, help build the consciousness of workers who are working in the shipyards in Niterói. And there's this cute Trotskyist. There's this woman who goes unnamed, who he has a crush on. It's one of the reasons actually in his telling that he's thinking about joining this organization, Port. And he says, he makes a bit of a pass at the woman, and she says, "No, my sweet Trotskyist said while sticking her pointer finger into my chest, comrade, at this stage of the struggle, all of our energies must be focused on fighting against the bourgeoisie, and we must avoid any and all class deviations." Okay, so it's like this kind of hilarious anecdote with a cloyingly sweet title of My Sweet Trotskyist, but it also tells us a lot of things. One, he's trying to let his readers know that he was naive, right? That when he was at this point, he was about 16, he still didn't have a stronger political consciousness, and he thought that flirting on the docks was a good thing. He was maybe going to join a political organization because there was a cute girl there, right? But it's also hinting us about kind of the sexiness of the 1960s and the fact that even though a dictatorship is about to seize power, it still is this moment of opportunity, right? He's feeling young and vibrant. And this comes up at other points in his book, or in his story that I talk about in the book. On the eve of him going to actually join the armed struggle and going underground, and he's going to go to the Iguazu forest to do guerrilla training, he tells this story of being at a party, and he very vividly describes a woman's sweaty, sexy body as they're dancing. And she looks at him and says, "Can I come home with you?" And he says, "No, I have to leave in the morning." And it was as if she knew he was never coming back. Right? And both of those examples are things that initially I had not included in the drafts of the chapters because it felt gratuitous, right? It felt kind of very self-absorbed. But in both instances, he said, no, remember that story? You have to put that back in. And so this is the type of kind of self-reflexive kind of transparency that I have to do with the reader in the book, of not only then including those stories, right, as part of the way he has told his life story, but then saying, this is something that Aluízio insisted that I put in, right? Because for him, these quite gendered, quite sexualized tropes are also about his own memories of what life in the 1960s as this kind of, soon to be armed insurgent meant for him. Okay, so we can now, that first memory took place in 1963. We can jump ahead 5 years now to 1968. At this point, Brazil is ruled by a dictatorship. It is becoming an increasingly repressive place. And in June of 1968, the largest demonstration to date and during Brazil's dictatorship takes place, what's known as the March of the 100,000. This was kind of an escalating moment where more and more Brazilians were starting to clamor for the kind of the lessening of dictatorship, and also the outright end of military rule. So here is a Facebook post marking the 50th anniversary of the March of the 100,000s. And to his many, many thousands of Facebook followers, Aluízio makes a post in 2018 about the march. And there he kind of writes, uses the kind of very famous image. He says, on that June 26, 1968, I crossed the Guanabara Bay with a group of classmates from the Federal Fluminense University and some high school students. We were nervous. At that time, the dictatorship was using extreme violence, even killing protesters, right? And then he goes on to describe how they went through the crowds, where they marched from, the sense of the feeling, right? This pulsing a moment. The dictatorship suffered a great defeat. It was really something amazing. The only problem with this is that Aluízio wasn't there, right? And this, more than anything else in the book, gave me trouble. How do I deal with the fact that in some ways, Aluízio lied, right? And this is, for a biographer dealing with memory, this L word, lying, is tricky. And how do I know that he wasn't there? Well, because in every other aspect of my research and all my interviews with him, he was quite insistent. It was quite clear in the record that once he went underground and went to do training in the Iguaçu Park in late 1967, he stayed there until getting arrested 2 years later, right? And how do I even know about this discrepancy in his story? Well, I did all the interviews with him. I interviewed other people, but then also I made an entire archive of his Facebook page. So I had this, right? It's quite clear to me that there's a discrepancy here. And I sat with this information for a really long time, not really sure what to do with it. And at first I just kind of asked Aluízio several questions of, so once you went underground, did you ever go back to Rio? Did you ever leave? He said, no. There's like this one time that I went to visit my father when he was sick. I snuck back in, but other than that, I was dedicated to the work. So what do I do? This then comes back to the question of the collaborative biography. When I went to give Aluízio the draft that this chapter was in, I not only shared with him the findings and my initial analysis of it, but I told him, hey, just so you know, this chapter shows this discrepancy. And I just left it at that. Granted, I don't know his initial reaction necessarily. I wasn't in the room with him when he was scrolling on his laptop looking at the chapter, but he then replied to my email, right, as he always did, giving comments and said, oh, that was, I made a mistake. I was remembering a march from 1964 that I do know that he was at earlier, which similarly took place in Rio de Janeiro. He would have taken the same ferry boat across from Niterói, similar details. But what do I do with that, right? And this is politically tricky too, because there are so many, far-right forces who would love to discredit human rights activists, who say, they just make up stories, all these stories about torture and violence and disappearances. It's all a load of BS. So to do memory work and to do scholarship on memory as biography, you also have to balance the need to have a critical, nuanced eye to the stories that you're told, with the need to place them into larger context and to ask questions about why and how people articulate these stories. So a Phantom March 50 years later, on the one hand, the memories of that day, the March of the 100,000 in June of 1968, did become this ubiquitous moment, right? This is almost like the greatest symbolic moment in leftist folklore for Brazil, right? This was the moment when 100,000 people came together and peacefully demonstrated to demand the return of civilian rule. Before then, the dictatorship entered into a more violent phase, right? People talk about these moments so much, they become symbols in a collective consciousness that even though Aluísio was 1,000 kilometers away, like very much suffering in the Atlantic rainforest, trying to basically play like cosplay as Che Guevara, he can talk about having been there and with no sense of kind of embarrassment about doing this, share it with his thousands of followers on Facebook, right? Elevating these stories. And this also relates to his desires to have placed himself at a really important historical event, right? He's this middleman figure, this kind of on the periphery of fame and history who wants to be at a central moment, right? And particularly because Aloysio's participation in the armed struggle failed, right? The armed groups did not overthrow Brazil's dictatorship. If anything, you can argue that their participation made things some ways worse because the government then used the existence of a relatively small number of armed militants to unleash this really disproportionate amount of violence on Brazilian society. And so to place himself not only at an important historical moment, but one that represented a final peaceful effort to end the dictatorship, helps kind of remake his own understanding of having participated in a largely unsuccessful armed revolutionary moment too. And finally, right, we need to kind of wrap it up with this question of perpetrator, right? Those who had participated directly and committed human rights abuses hold so much power, particularly in a culture like Brazil, where there is no legal repercussion for not giving testimony. When perpetrators do come forward, you have to think about why they do so. What are the motivations? Some are trying to clear their conscience, right? We have a lot of examples of this. Others who give testimony as a way to kind of show their power and flex their importance, and really essentially, I guess, in modern parlance, like to troll Brazilian society. And it's complicated, but we are so reliant on them because in a culture of impunity where the state cannot compel the armed forces to provide evidence, perpetrators themselves essentially hold the key to what had happened, right? They're the ones who witnessed directly when someone had been disappeared. They're often some of the only surviving people who could tell us what happened. So the kind of quick story, and there's a whole backstory of a drama for how we know this, is that eventually Aluízio was able to get the testimony of a man named Otávio Reinolfo, who confessed to having been the driver during the 1974 killings of the 6 disappeared militants, right? And here's a map showing where they were likely killed in the Iguaçu National Park. As I mentioned, the bodies have never been found. Here is Aluízio at one of the several excavations that proved unsuccessful, right? So we rely on Otávio Reinolfo to have given the precise details, saying, okay, we drove on this road for about 5 minutes, and then I remember we made them get out of the car at this turn in the road, and there was a clearing, and I think that's where it happened. Okay, so we're relying on his memories for that. And when Brazil will eventually have its Truth Commission, the official Truth Commission, which started in 2012, its final report in 2014, Otávio Reinolfo is summoned to give testimony, not legally binding, right? He cannot be held in contempt for it's not a subpoena, right? He is summoned, he is invited to give his testimony. It's the same testimony that he has given several times already as part of the excavations. And he does it, he tells the same stories that he always has. But by this point in 2013, Aluízio has already written his memoir. He's already continued most of his memory work, which often involves talking about Otávio Reinolfo. So we see a real bitter animosity between Aluízio and this perpetrator, right? And because here, Otávio Reinolfo is both a witness to what had happened, and he is someone who had been complicit in the murders. And along with giving his memories about what had happened, of where in the clearing they got out of the car and killed it, Otávio Reinolfo also kind of goes off script at some point. And about in the middle of the transcript, you see that he starts getting very angry at Aluízio, specifically. He even talks specifically about Aloysio's memoir, which had gotten a fair amount of publicity by this point. And in doing this, and in giving his testimony, he accuses Aluízio of having been a double agent who was involved in the murders also. Right? In a lot of ways, this is outlandish, right? Like Aluízio as a torture victim, as a political prisoner, and someone who has then devoted the second half of his life to actually find the bodies. And so Otávio Reinolfo accuses Aluísio of having been a mole who's involved. And it's important to say that this has some basis in contextual fact. There were other double agents, former militants who had been flipped after being tortured by the Brazilian dictatorship, who then helped the dictatorship lure other militants to their deaths, right? So there's two main examples of when this had happened. But in this testimony to Brazil's Truth Commission, Otávio Reinolfo, who has all of this power to give the details about what had happened, also then accuses Aluísio. And this is kind of at the heart of why perpetrator testimony is so difficult, because in so many ways, we take his statements at face value. Oh, great, because we are thirsting to know some of the truth about what had happened. And because Otávio Reinolfo is one of the only people who can tell us where these bodies might be, we give him so much power to tell that story. Yet we also have to then say, okay, well, that statement was outlandish, right? Aluísio was not a double agent. But we show kind of a willingness to suspend our disbelief only at part of his statements, but not others, right? And this is this paradox of perpetrator testimony. So again, what do I do with these types of statements? In my initial chapter drafts, I write about Otávio's testimony to the Truth Commission. I do my normal kind of memory analysis and social history analysis of why he might have said these things, and the kind of, this double standard of believing certain parts of his testimony, but not others. And I then send a chapter draft to Aluísio. He does not reply for quite some time. Eventually, he emails me back, says, "Hello, Jake. Attached here are my observations about draft 9. This was a difficult, inglorious task, needing to revise these kind of elisions, these kind of like half-truths and fake news. Hugs. And I'm sorry. I try to support your work and I seek to collaborate." And for Aluísio, even the fact that I analyzed Otávio Reinolfo's testimony, even the fact that I mentioned and discussed the kind of slanderous statement that Aluísio was a double agent, for him was almost unforgivable, right? Saying, why would you even bring that in? It is giving this perpetrator more space in a way that it should never have, right? And this was part of the difficult balancing act that I had to do. And I'll just wrap up with one thing here. And so I started these memory examples, giving an example of when I added more information after Aluísio collaborated and read the chapter drafts, right, about My Sweet Trotskyist. Here, I did the opposite. I removed certain parts. I had initially a much lengthier analysis of Otávio's testimony. And what I also then did is I gave kind of much stronger barbed types of phrasings. I talked about kind of outlandish statements, vindictive statements, trying to make it more obvious that I did not believe Otávio's statements about Aluísio having been a double agent. And on the whole, this seemed to make Aluísio happy, right? He has since read every chapter, every observation, every draft of the book, including the final version that's going to be published soon and published at the same time in Brazil. I mean, even then, he didn't love the fact that I talked about Otávio at all. And it was a very kind of funny quote. He said, well, yes, okay, the draft is now better, but you still talk about it and it's at the end of the book. And because it's at the end, your readers might remember that most. And, you always remember your last kiss, right? So again, this kind of sexualized banter that underwrote a lot of our interactions. But these are the types of decisions as kind of a scholar, as a collaborator, that I had to make over the course of the book. And so, by way of conclusion, I'll just kind of have a few of these points here, right? Memory as transition. Lack of transitional justice mechanisms for Brazil, where there was a Truth Commission, but it came very late, and it had no subpoena power and no prosecutorial power. Memory was the way that activists and survivors like Aluízio Palmar found their own form of justice. And narrative and self-narration is at the key of that, talking about one's own life in a way that is repetitive, it's practiced, and it's performative. And then more broadly, as we've been talking about, kind of the importance and the need to really think about a nuanced approach to oral history as a methodology and as an avenue for thinking through the political implications of doing this type of biographical work. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. And I'm really looking forward to a discussion about any thoughts that you all might have.
Please, you can either post your questions in the chat, or if you like, if you can, pose them directly.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Jake, thank you for a fabulous talk.
What a wonderful talk, by the way.
Fabulous
Yes.
talk, and for a book that I'm really excited to read, because I think it's going to add a lot to sort of the genre of memory studies of Latin American military dictatorships. But I want to ask you specifically, like, doing this sort of like really critical analysis of memory in the context of a biography. Like there've been a lot of big biographies that have come out recently, things like John French's biography of Lula, like, and people might sort of like refer to in passing the way that people have created and recreated narratives about their lives, but not to this extent that I've seen. Are there other people doing this kind of work, this sort of really intense engagement with all the different narratives that somebody's creating, or is this something pretty unique to what you're doing here?
I mentioned before my hesitancy to ever use the word exceptional in terms of history, and I'm also equally allergic to the word unique. But to my understanding, I think this level of kind of self-reflective, collaborative memory work as a biography hasn't been done. There's a few really fascinating and important books, one on Peru and one on Chile, that were kind of co-authored biographies, where really the predominant voice is of an indigenous activist and political militant. Rosa Isolde Yauque in Chile. And there, this role of the scholar is to kind of help promote and curate, and then put together what is more of a work of testimonial biography, kind of a first-person autobiography. But to my knowledge, at this level, with the amount of back and forth and kind of first-person usage, analyzing the work of the life story, I don't think it's been done yet. And so, and I kind of got a sense of that as the project was starting to take shape. And that's one of the reasons why I took several extra years to make sure I did it like really well and didn't rush it, because I realized all the different ways that it could go wrong. Jokingly, about every few months, Aluízio would ask me, how's the book's progressing? And he would say, I hope I'm still alive when I see it. So in the end, it ended up taking a lot longer than he wanted it to. But I think the result is something that we're both like really happy with.
I just have to point out a lot longer than he wanted it to, but you did publish 3 scholarly monographs in 6 years. So
yeah,
Putting us all to shame.
trying to get him to realize like peer review as like a long-term thing. That was also some of my challenges.
Susanna, did you want to jump in with the question? We also have one in the Q&A.
Put the Q&A in.
So we have a question from Gabriela Rodriguez asking, how does Aluízio Palmar rationalize his involvement in an armed movement in Brazil, and what role does self-reflection or its absence play in his narrative? And I know you touched on this a little bit in the talk, but if you'd like to elaborate on that a little bit more.
Oh, thank you, Gabriela. That's such an important question, and it's really interesting to see the arc of his own understanding of his political participation. He essentially chalks it up, like a lot of people of his generation do. He's like, well, that's what we thought was the best way at the time, right? In the early 1960s, we joined the Brazilian Communist Party because we were developmentalists. We thought about the political stages where you had to kind of change social democracy to get workers' rights and to eventually lead to socialism. We saw that that wasn't enough, so then we took up arms. We were inspired by Cuba. We were inspired by Régis Debray, thinking about what an armed revolution could be like. And then that didn't happen. And only now I can look back and see that I was young and naive. And so he frames what he's now doing as part of kind of this ampla frente, right? This like kind of broad, united front of needing to work across political parties and even a little bit across the political spectrum. It's easy for him to rationalize that also because the context of almost all of our work together was with Jair Bolsonaro as president. So at that point, he has the long-term enemy to be this far-right apologist of military rule who makes it a lot easier for Aluízio to say, let's work with the centrist, right? Let's work with these other political groups that 30 years ago, I would have said they were bourgeois sellouts, but now I see a need to collaborate with them to kind of work against our common enemy. So it's an interesting counterfactual to think how he would imagine his life at this kind of later stage, he's now in his early 80s, if Bolsonaro hadn't happened, right? Would there have been a bit of more nostalgia for having participated in armed revolution? And he's often critical of some of his former colleagues who are more kind of within that romantic notion of what they had done when they were younger and taking up arms and had, they were the barbudos, right, being involved in guerrilla warfare. But what we have for him is this understanding that he was sued by his former torturer because of the type of presidency that Jair Bolsonaro has. So that places in quite stark relief not only his politics at that moment in the late 2010s, early 2020s, but then also looking back across his life.
As a follow-up to that, I have a question to follow up to that. So I think as you were and you'd already finished the interviews and you were in the process of writing everything up in in 2020 office again. Date from the email was what, February, politically amidst the new Lula government with Bolsonaro at least temporarily out of the way.
Yeah. Yeah, and that features into some of the analysis of kind of the later stages of drafting the book, where there's this amount of relief, right? He feels tangible relief. And so in some of our final interviews, he talks about that. And one of the kind of structural ways that I wanted to give that kind of last type of moment is the final part of the book. Most of the conclusion, basically extended transcript of one of our interviews, one of very, very final interviews that for a set of reasons ended being this really long reflection on his own life, where normally I kind of had to prod him to be kind of more self-reflexive. Here he just kind of ran with it. And so I end the book as much in his own words, whereas much of the book is me writing a biography about him. That was a space where I wanted to let his words stand on their own the most. And that's where we see some of his reflections.
Thanks.
Interviews with him, were there any mentions or reflections on other revolutionary movements, both in Brazil? I'm thinking of the Araguaia movement, which has the closest sort of analog to it, but also things like FARC, which had a political context. Sendero did too, but it was so weird. It was so radically different in its inspiration. But the Araguaia one and the FARC were very clearly sort of inspired by the Cuban Revolution and the restructuring of the national state. So I'm just curious if he had any views on this kind of question.
Oh yeah, he has views on everything, right?
I would imagine. I would imagine.
And here, he's also doing this constant comparison between his own experience and other either revolutionary militants or exiles. And I'll get to your question in a second, but part of this is he sees his own life as much harder than most others, because he says, well, exiles like Fernando Gabeira, Alfredo Serkis ended up going to Europe, living overseas, having this great time. I was living in rural Argentina, like selling soda door to door, right? So his sense that his particular trajectory, and this goes back to this question of memory at the margins, was harder, right? And that his story doesn't naturally fit in to these better known stories and these kind of small handful of militant memoirs that in the early 80s became bestsellers, right? And I talk about Fernando Gabeira and Alfredo Serkis in particular, because there's O Que Es Su Compañero and Os Carabineros were the two kind of tell-all militant memoirs in the 1980s. So Aluízio is writing his book 2-3 decades after these initial memoirs. So he's aware of them. He knows that they're bestsellers, and he's trying to do something different, in part because he thinks they had it easy. Right? It's not to say someone like Fernando Gabeira, who had been in armed revolutionary group, helped lead the kidnapping of the U.S. ambassador, right? It was imprisoned, all of these things. But he sees his part as kind of the more pure version, right? That his suffering was greater in part, and that's why he has to go out of his way to tell a story. And to the question of Araguaia, Aluízio's group was one of 2, maybe 3 that actually opted for rural guerrilla training and operations rather than just urban militancy. Most of the armed groups in Brazil were operating primarily in Rio or Sao Paulo, Belo Horizonte a little bit, and they were kind of doing more urban actions, right? Kidnapping diplomats, robbing banks, that type of work. Aluízio was one of the only groups that went out and did guerrilla training, like really thinking about kind of a Cuban style movement. The Araguaia War, led primarily by the Maoist-leaning PCdoB, was one of the other ones. And so he's thinking about that, particularly because Araguaia War came to an end in 1972, I believe. Most of the rural and almost all of the urban insurgencies by that point had been decimated. Right. So he sees Araguaia as kind of, oh, that would have been nice several years earlier when we were going around telling everyone we have to go to the ir pro mata, right? We have to go into the forest. Now is the time. So he'll think that if the PCdoB and others had done that earlier, and if they had combined forces, maybe something could have been successful. So he's thinking about that, but always in this kind of triangulation between what his own sense of his experience had been.
Yeah, that Araguaia story is very interesting, and it has a lot of echoes. The echoes of the Araguaia still reverberate through the region in a kind of mythological way.
Yeah.
We have a comment from Luciana Castro saying, I'm Brazilian and so honored to hear your well-versed talk about Aluízio and the implications of the dictatorship to this day. I hope to see you talk again.
Oh, thank you, Lucy. I really appreciate that.
And we also have a question from Jane Rubin Kurtzman asking, thank you for a really fascinating and important talk. You've made a great substantive and methodological contribution to the study of repression as a part of global history, especially in the margins. My question refers precisely to the applicability of your methodology in a more global context. For example, Spain, Cambodia, even Nazi Germany. Is there an international collaboration to further these kinds of studies and the development of methodologies to further our understanding of what occurred?
Thank you, Jane. I really appreciate that question. And it was actually precisely for those reasons that I felt that I was approaching something that, felt important. And I wanted it to be useful, not only in Brazil, but across Latin America and elsewhere. For the last several years now, I've been actually sadly moving away from studying just Latin America. And my new project is a global history of the phrase never again. So I've started doing a lot of work on building case studies and collaborations with scholars elsewhere to really analyze narrative and memory in a global context. So as you say, Spain, Cambodia, yes, I'm writing a chapter at the moment on Bangladesh and its efforts to think about this as well. And so for questions of memory script and how to do this methodology, yeah, that's my hope. And in the book, I give, the book is written more for a popular audience. I want it to be very, very engaging. So I don't try to do the overly kind of schematic methodological reflections, but I have part of it in the introduction. Then I wrote an article separately also to try to basically offer a toolkit for doing this. And it's not to say that I think this approach can just be used as a kind of one size fits all for all type of oral history work, because it does require kind of a long-term engagement with your subject, where you also have to do a lot of interviews and try to think about other ways that they've shared their memories. But there are just so many people across the world who have been telling their story for precisely the same reasons of truth-telling and testifying and bearing witness to that. And I think there is really important kind of transcultural and transnational work to be done. And I hope that this will offer even just a tiny little added motivation for scholars to keep thinking about this.
Awesome. What about the so you said as you were going along, you were translating into Portuguese, sending it to review, which I would also mean that you'll be able to quicker than one normally would in Portuguese to have it published in Brazil, right? Since you have a draft of it in Portuguese already. What's the timeline for that?
Coming out about the same time. It'll be coming out about a month later in Brazil with Editora Garamond. And this is something that I learned the hard way with my first book of how much work it takes to get your book translated and published in Brazil. So then for my subsequent books, I like was keyed in on this from the very get-go. I was very fortunate that I had a grant from the UK's Arts and Humanities Research Council that helped pay for the eventual translation. The chapter drafts for Aluízio I did myself, so he was also reading like good but not great Portuguese for the drafts. Then eventually got a really wonderful translator who I've worked with several times before. And then so it also means that the final version that Aluízio basically signed off on was the professionally translated one. And that will be out hopefully sometime in the next month or two. So
Congratulations. I'm starting the process of translating my own book, and so I'm gonna email you about your experience.
I have the best translator. She's amazing. And
Yeah,
we can talk about it.
all of our ears are pricking up here, you know. Wait a minute, I think we all need a good translator, given that mine is totally Portuguese caipira. So the other question I had was sort of thinking about when, as you were talking, I was thinking about a couple of fairly famous biographies too, which had an interlocutor, but sort of that drops out of the story in a way. One is I, Rigoberta Menchú, and then the other one is Albert's The Falling Sky with Davi Yanomami. They're both with indigenous populations, indigenous people who are resistance figures, but in a kind of a different context. I wonder if you'd like to comment on their role, because you've really set out your methodology very clearly. In these others, it's not really clear what their methods are. So I'm just curious what you think of these, because these are for Amazonian scholars, of course, or indigenous scholars. These are very important works. So I'm just curious about what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so the I, Rigoberta Menchú, as kind of mentioned with the fallout of the David Stoll debacle, was really at the front of my mind for how not to do it. And it's not necessarily, not to wade into the debate. And she's about why that Borgosta wrote the book that ended up being I, Rigoberta Menchú, on that moment of solidarity while the nation and genocide of indigenous Guatemala was ongoing. And so what that campaign meant at the time. But what we know is that it then kind of helped birth this genre of testimonio, right? Of which The Falling Sky is very much a part of. And testimonio as kind of an in the moment truth telling, bearing witness to an ongoing, example of violence, often against indigenous communities, right? And so at first, I wasn't quite sure if my book would be kind of skirting the lines of being a testimonio, because I didn't know at first what it was going to be come. But the way that testimonial functions is basically the subject giving a story in their own words, and the role, if a scholar is involved, is to help kind of give it form and function, and then help disseminate it, right? And maybe lending their name as a co-author to help give it a bit more legitimacy or gravitas. That's one of the reasons why I initially asked Aluízio if he wanted to do that, right? If he wanted this to be that type of work. He didn't want to, and for the kind of political conjecture that was happening around our book, it didn't feel necessarily like a work of testimonio, and it would have felt also perhaps a little bit gratuitous in the sense that Aluízio, he grew up kind of quite working class, but for all intents and purposes, he's like a middle-class white guy who, aside from the early struggles of his political life and then the trauma of having been a torture victim, like he's done okay, right? He's led the life that he wants to in a lot of ways. So the personal struggles of having to have his story told aren't quite the same, where something like Rigoberta Menchú has the need to tell her story because otherwise that story will not get out, right? She went to Paris to tell and to bring awareness to what was going on in Guatemala because there was not an international voice paying attention to what was happening at that time, right? That needed to come out. For Aluízio, he spent the last 2 decades telling his story. So my work with him couldn't necessarily be testimonio because he didn't need me to tell his story. In some ways, he then used me to tell his story to new and larger audiences, but he was doing fine on his own before that. So the clinical and kind of the personal expediency of that is different. But this was something that I was thinking about a lot, that at several points in our interview, I talked to him explicitly about. I wanted him to know why I was kind of suggesting that our book go in certain ways, is because I didn't want it to necessarily be something like a testimonial, because that didn't feel natural, and didn't also feel analytically or even politically the most useful genre.
It's interesting too. I'm thinking about Rigoberta and a little bit about Davi Yanomami, is that the use of electronic media and storage and access to these the creation of a personal archive around these questions, I think is really interesting. And those were alternatives, those were inputs into the construction of a memoria or testimonio that were not really available to either Davi Yanomami or Rigoberta Menchú. So this also represents a kind of a different shift, because you talk about Facebook pages and his blog and all of that. Those are kinds of practices that would not have been available really before quite recently.
Of course.
Even if you had the documents sitting in your house, you couldn't really get them out.
And almost all of our interviews took place on Zoom or WhatsApp audio or Google Meets, right? It was an almost entirely virtual methodology as well. And to go back to Jane's point, I want this book to help inspire others to do the same type of work, right? In part, I did this because of the pandemic, and then in part, I did this because I have a young family and I can't go spend a year in Brazil in the way that I could when I was a grad student. But the work is the same, I think, in the end. And there's some things that get lost. And at certain times in the book, I talk about how being there in person to do some of these interviews would have been useful. But all 3 dozen interviews that I did with other people were also totally virtual, right? It helps, as Brian knows well, right? Like Brazilians are so good at WhatsApp, right? They're so good at Facebook. It made that type of exchange really, really easy. But even if I wasn't able to have WhatsApp conversations with an 85-year-old, which was great. I struggle with my own parents, there's still ways to do this.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And also this whole transformative technologies that now become available really makes things much easier. And also your current project on Nevermore, Never Again. I think it's the Raven that says nevermore, not everyone else who says never again. But that has to be
ominous, though. A little less Edgar Allan Poe in my next project, but I like it still.
You can use that as the sort of introduction, as the epigraph. Have we got any more questions?
Another couple of questions popped up. Yes.
Yeah, let's go.
Also, our dear colleague Mariana, who is head of the cultural sector of the Brazilian consulate in LA, said she would like to thank you, Mariana Benavides. I would like to thank you for your research. It's more relevant than ever. You've probably seen that the success of the film I'm Still Here has reignited the debate on revising the amnesty law. Yeah, any comments on the contemporary right now implications of your work as well?
Mariana, thank you so much, and thank you for coming to the talk. I'm so happy to know that there's someone from the consulate involved in this. That makes me really happy. So yeah, ainda estou aqui. Gosh, what a force right now at the moment. And there's so many things we could say about this. And I've read, so many great takes on why it's the best thing that's happened in the last several decades and how it still could go a little bit farther, right? As any great cultural production does, it's just sparked debate. It sparked reflection. The fact that it won the Oscar for Best International Feature is amazing. We would have loved Fernanda to win the Best Actress or Best Film, but we'll take that next time. So several things that I want to say that. One, I'm just so floored by the fact that the STF, the Brazilian Supreme Court, is now shown in willingness to reopen the amnesty debate, particularly around the question of disappearances, and saying that actually disappearances might not legally fall under the purview of the 1979 amnesty law. And they are explicitly invoking the case of Paiva, right? They're talking specifically about what had happened to the Paiva family, which is the focus of Ainda Estou Aqui. So, right, this is like rarely in history do we get a one-to-one impact of such immediate turnaround. But the tension brought about by this movie, with hopefully not getting too ahead of ourselves, might actually make a real dent into legal justice, right? That's quite amazing. I started this project long before I knew that Walter Salas's movie was coming out, right? It's going to help bring a bit of more, awareness of the book that I'm writing, because Aluízio's book, life story, is quite cinematographic in some ways. A lot of people joke, so when's the movie on Aluízio coming out? I say, I don't know. No. There's enough. Aluízio might want to take that in some ways. But I'm so happy that the movie has been getting so much attention and really bringing a lot of focus on these questions and the ongoing importance of these debates about memory.
And in fact, we here in LA were privileged to see the movie back in October before it even came out in Brazil, in no small measure due to the efforts of Mariana and the Setor Cultural at the consulate, because the film was screened at the Hollywood Brazilian Film Festival at the end of October, with a Q&A with Fernanda Torres and Celton Mello, who were at the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures. So one of the perks of being in LA. You may have universal health care in Canada, but we get early screenings of
We
film
get the
here.
movies earlier. Better that way. Other questions?
No, Gabriela Cruz, graduate student from Spanish and Portuguese here. If it's the Gabriela Cruz I'm thinking it is. Just said, thank you for your amazing presentation. How else can I access your research?
Thank you, Gabriela. So for the Aluízio Palmar book, it's going to come out next month with University of North Carolina Press. I've already published one article from this research that came out late last year, I think in November, with the Journal of Latin American Studies. And I've written a few blog posts about Aluízio. You can just kind of Google my name and Aluízio's name. Some of it will come up. And otherwise, the other work that I've done on the Itaipu Dam or on the Prestes column is all out there. The Prestes column is
Writing from the interior. Wait.
the interior. I got to plug the book that Susanna wrote such a great epilogue
No,
for.
you don't have to,
University
but
of Texas Press.
it's a great book.
So yeah, thank you for that.
I don't see any more questions, so unless Susanna has any more.
No, I think we'll let Jake go on to the rest of his afternoon. But thank you so much for this fascinating and really interesting and really stimulating talk. And of course, it makes us all review our own strategies when we're working with oral histories. That's for sure.
And everyone also, Susanna and I are still finalizing our programming for the spring quarter, but there should be an email shortly after the start of the spring quarter with our lineup of events then. Any final words, Jake?
Say hi to California for me. I miss it. I'm happy here, but California will always be my home state. So enjoy.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone.